working, then find out later that it didn't work the entire time. And then also, I would want you to keep an eye on the chat in there as well, so that if anybody asks any questions during the talk, which I highly doubt will happen, you will be responsible for asking their question for them. Are we streaming? Are we live? Are we good?
Yep, you are good.
Beautiful.
A little bit of a lag time. Just put the camera on.
Yeah, that's to be expected. Cool, cool. I like it when things just work. Okay, cool. I'm going to start off with stuff that I've done to this website because I have code for this up and ready to go, and I've actually done some performance stuff to the plugin that I've been working on this thing in particular. We'll dive into that in a second, but let's start off with what I was talking about earlier, the segue that didn't go quite so well. So WordPress is not the most performant thing out there. I would say probably the top #1 reason why WordPress tends to be slow in the grand scheme of things, if we were to just take an average across all of WordPress, is that there are a lot of people out there that use WordPress to build websites that don't know what they're doing. Let's just be 100, okay? It's so easy to get a website up and running with WordPress that people that don't really know what they're doing are empowered to go ahead and do it, and probably successfully too. They'll probably get their site up and it's going to be working. But what happens thereafter is that because of the lack of knowledge of how the web works, very simple mistakes happen, like uploading a 4 megabyte image to the home page of their website and that needing to load before the entire home page loads. That happens way more than you guys might think. So if we were just looking at the numbers on average of like, hey, let's look at all the WordPress sites across the entire interwebs and measure how fast they all boot up, you know, how long it takes to load that first page, essentially, the home page, it would not be a very flattering number, to say the least, because of this reason in particular. People loading a bunch of plugins that they don't need, people that are, the images are a big one, old versions of PHP, okay, so if you're running PHP version anything lower than 7, you are doing a huge disservice to the entire internet. There's literally no reason why any WordPress site on the entire world should not be running at PHP 7, and so that will give you a big performance hit. Bad hosting providers, you know, people going for like the cheapest option or not so well-known options, or just having a WordPress site out there that hasn't even been looked at or touched in the past 8 years or something, which is totally possible. You know, these are all things that could possibly happen that will drop that rating, or I guess raise the average, if we were to count in terms of seconds, how many seconds it takes to load the home page. Those are the people that are going to raise that average number of seconds easily. And so that's one reason why WordPress gets kind of a bad rap for being not so performant. So let's look at some other things that are involved there. And also keep in mind, before I go any further, we do have a whole meetup at the end of this month designed for admin style users, so people that are not coders or developers, that's kind of going over this same topic. So I'm not going to go into, you know, performance plugins or image resizing plugins, or, you know, just like all these little like tips and tricks for kind of like beginner level users to make their website more performant. We have a whole another meetup scheduled at the end of the month for exactly that. Today is going to be mostly designed for programming, so we're going to look at, you know, what we can do as WordPress developers to make sure that our plugin isn't slowing websites down, essentially, or theme, I guess. So if you have questions in regards to simpler stuff like that, I'd be happy to answer them later towards the end of the talk, but we're going to try and focus on more code level stuff towards the beginning. Yes.
Also, spoiler, if you want more of an admin perspective on kind of what he was just scratching the surface on, February 27th, I'll be giving a lecture here on that too. Just common mistakes that WordPress users make to slow the performance of their own sites inadvertently. So February 27th, shameless plug.
Yeah.
We need numbers.
Yeah. Well, and thanks very much to you for like
Yeah, it's
volunteering to speak, essentially, because as the lead organizer, it is quite a lot of effort to not only organize these, but also get up here and do like all of the talks, which is how it tends to turn out, at least a large majority of them. So by all means, if anybody ever wants to do a talk for WP Omaha, please actually go to this website under events, request to speak. There's a form right here, and please go fill out this form if you have any topic that you feel like you would like to get up and talk to everybody about. Fill out this form, submit it, it goes to me, I overlook it. Sometimes I'll suggest like a small tweak to your topic or whatever to make it either not clash with something we've recently discussed, or to make it a little bit more intriguing for people. But yeah, I should not be the only person doing these talks, nor should I be the only person organizing. We're also looking for organizers, by the way. So if you're interested in helping organize this meetup group, talk to me after this class. But yeah, like I was saying, he's going to be speaking next month, and so if you have questions about simple stuff of how to make your site faster, kind of save those questions for the end. But anything about programming or speed or whatever, please feel free to raise your hand and ask anytime. Now, on this website, we have a plugin that I've developed that allows our website to integrate specifically with meetup.com. So you'll see that we've got this thing up here that tells us when the next meetup is, which is today's meetup, and then this on the side that shows you a bunch of future meetups. And so I developed this plugin from scratch to kind of help this website integrate better with meetup.com. I went ahead and went one step further, and it does a bunch of other stuff too. What it allows us to do is go in here and like check in at a meetup. And so this is a part that's still kind of under development, but it does technically work. If you're interested in checking out how that works, you can go to events, free meetups, and check in. And this will take you through a little user flow that allows you to register. And so what this is a little plugin built on what is it called? WP, not members, the social media one. Dang it, I can't remember what it's called. Well, there's another plugin that allows us to turn our WordPress site into a social media platform, essentially, kind of like a makeshift Facebook or whatever. And so I installed that plugin, and my plugin extends that plugin, and it will allow you to go ahead and register with your meetup credentials by clicking on this guy right here, and then you just log into meetup.com with your meetup credentials. It uses Meetup to SSO you into this system and create an account for you. Then you can check in to this meetup essentially, which is pretty cool. And so the reason I'm pointing this out is when I first designed this plugin, I realized that because we were going to be constantly hitting an API to get data from meetup.com, there might be some performance issues with that, depending on how rapidly, how frequently we're hitting their API and getting data back. But then later found out that that wasn't the only reason I needed to be concerned about how rapidly and how frequently I was hitting their API. So if we go to meetup.com API, they've got a whole API documentation thing in here, and you'll see that, if I can find it, I don't want to spend too much time looking for the part of this that talks about limits. There it goes, right there. Limits and throttling. So first of all, whenever you're developing a plugin for WordPress that utilizes a third-party API, you're obviously going to want to read that API's documentation. It's just a necessary evil. It's not something that's particularly fun, but it does make your life easier, because it gives you all the information you need about their API. And then you run into stuff like this, and the resolution on this is not great, so I'll zoom in on this so you guys can read this. But essentially what it's telling us here is that they do limit and throttle the number of requests that we can make to this API. So if we make too many requests to the API from our domain over a certain period of time, guess what happens?
I don't want to talk to you no more.
Yep.
Cut off.
Exactly. Yeah, it's going to send you to voicemail. Like an old, jaded ex-girlfriend. So you don't want that to happen, because then all of a sudden your site breaks without you even knowing. So this isn't really a problem for websites to get like a standard amount of traffic. Like this website in particular, our wpomaha.org website, this website does not get that much traffic. Okay, maybe, I think the most I've seen is like 30 to 40 visits in a day. All right, so that's not a lot, and I don't think that amount of traffic is going to trigger the plugin that I've created. However, I designed this plugin to be distributed to anybody who has a website for their meetup. And so what if it's a meetup that's dramatically more popular than our meetup, right? It could it could be a thing that happens to them where they hit that limit inadvertently just because so many people visited their site, and every time somebody visited their site, the page makes a call to the API, and then so if you're all of a sudden getting thousands of visits to your site in an hour or something, and the API stops responding back to you, that's obviously a big problem. So what I've done in our plugin, and I guess it might be a good idea to log into the back end of this so you can kind of see what I'm talking about. Let's go back here, and then for those that don't do it this way, it's always a good idea to, when you log into the admin, do it on a separate tab right next to the one that points to the front end. Sorry, that was the wrong tab.
Quick question.
Yes.
You have your plugins available on the website. You know the plugin section where they show the plugins? Like
Where? What site?
On the dashboard. Like I go down to plugins.
He means the repository.
The repo.
Yeah.
Okay.
So you have some of your stuff over there, like the meetup?
Do I have a plugin on there?
Yeah.
No, I don't. No.
Dude, I think the meetup definitely deserves it.
Well, the problem is that the plugin is not in a state that I feel like is ready for distribution. So you do have, it is kind of a good idea to make sure that your plugin is kind of vetted and tested before you try to submit it to the repo, because otherwise you could get rejected or get it on there and then get it taken down. That's never a good look, So yeah, you don't want to be that guy. So and neither do I. So my plugin still needs a bit of work before I put it up there. Eventually I will put it up there, but yeah, it's not there yet. I hope you don't think I'm less legit because I don't have plugins on the repo, but I have developed 20 plugins or so by this point.
Well, there's also work-life issues too, because if you want to field support emails forever for
Boom.
no reimbursement.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, that could be a problem too.
so
Next thing you know, you've got 5, 6, 7, 8 people saying, "Hey, I tried to do something with your plugin and it didn't work like I expected." And then there's all these use cases that you didn't, scenarios that you didn't predict ahead of time. So now you're like, "Oh, I got to go fix my plugin," and then every night you're going home and working on your plugin that is free. That could tank your life real quickly. If I'm going to take my life for wasting time, I'd rather it be due to like playing video games or something, not maintaining a plugin. So that is definitely a good point. Anyway, so if we go into settings here, you'll see that MeatPress is the name of my plugin. I know that sounds weird because it's not making hamburgers or anything. It's literally the combination of the word meetup and WordPress. I just thought that was catchier than like #1 meetup plugin or something. I don't know. Anyway, you'll see what I have here is I've got a place for my settings. For those of you that are wondering how I made my own settings page in WordPress, I use frameworks for that always. Can you do it without the use of frameworks? Yes, you can. There's plenty of documentation about how to create your own settings areas in WordPress in the WordPress Codex without using frameworks. However, there's so many frameworks out there and none of them cost money, and they're so easy to implement that I don't believe that anybody should ever create a settings area for their plugin or theme without using a framework. It just doesn't make sense. The framework that I'm using here is called the Section 214 settings framework. So you can go ahead and look that up on GitHub if you want. That's what I used here, mostly because it's extremely lightweight, which is what I wanted for this plugin, because I want this plugin to be lightweight. It shouldn't be doing too much. And then also the guy who made that is one of the guys who started this meetup. So I thought that'd be a good way to support him. Anyway, so I installed that framework. That allowed me to create this settings page relatively easily by just constructing this giant array and passing it to the constructor object of the framework. And then next thing you know, I've got a page with some fields that I can submit, and they get saved to the database, and I can retrieve the values in any scenario. And the field that we're most interested in here, now obviously anytime you're doing with, like whenever you're integrating your plugin, or WordPress for that matter, with a third-party API, you're going to need authentication credentials. That's just the way that it goes. So you'll see here that we've got our fields for our authentication, so that our plugin can use the information that we enter into these fields to properly authenticate with the API and make sure that all of our calls are not rejected, because if you're not authenticated, they will get rejected. So that's what these are. These are just some fields that, you know, pass some secret keys and stuff like that to the API, so that they know that we've been given permission to use their API, and they know who we are when we are using their API, so that if we're doing anything malicious, they can track us back and block us if we're not following the guidelines of the API. But the most important value here in regards to what we're talking about at today's meetup is this field right here, the API call cache time. Whenever we're talking about performance, we're always, well, we're not always. Whenever we're talking about performance, it's extremely likely that the topic of caching is going to come up, because caching things is a nice and easy way to boost the performance of your site. Now, a lot of times when you talk about caching, you're talking about caching like HTML or images or something like that, right? Like things that tend to be a little heavier, things that tend to have to do with the UI or whatever. But you don't always have to cache that. We can actually use the concept of caching to cache a great number of things. And in this case, what we're using it for is to cache responses from the API, Meetups API in particular. And I wanted to make this a variable number so that we can appropriately adjust that cache time based on how active our website is. So if we have an extremely active website, instead of like caching it for only 1 minute or 2 minutes or 3 minutes, we could cache it for 10 minutes, 20 minutes, or 30 minutes, especially if we know that the information that we're getting from the API is going to be relatively the same across that time period. It doesn't have to be extremely real time. You know, if we like create a new meetup on meetup.com and somebody visits this website between the time we create that meetup and the time that this cache expires and they don't see that meetup, not the end of the world. Hopefully they end up coming back to our website in the next few days, and then at that time it will show up on the website. So it's not that big of a deal that it's like, because it's not a super real-time thing. These things are like scheduled, you know, hopefully weeks in advance if you're, you know, serious about meetup and you try to, you know, run a legitimate meetup. It's nice to do it at least 2 to 3 weeks in advance. So people should have a good time span there to get like up to date on what's going on with the meetup. So caching things for 10 minutes, 15 minutes, 20 minutes, not a big deal. So now the next question is, okay, Rob, that's cool. We understand that we should cache these calls for a couple of reasons. A, it makes our website more performant, and B, we don't piss off meetup.com. How do you do that? Like, I don't get it. So that's great. We should do that, but how? So I'll dive into the code. I'll show you how I did it here and what I'm using. We're going to talk about a very specific function in WordPress and a bunch of different ways that you can use it. And then we'll move on to some other things in PHP that allow us to enhance the performance of our plugin even more. So let me load up PHP Storm here. This is my IDE of choice. If I forget while I'm looking at this code on this screen here to like zoom in to the code, please yell at me or something, because I'm notorious for doing that. Obviously, you're never going to be able to read all the stuff in the left-hand side. I can't zoom in on that, unfortunately. But the stuff that loads in the main window over here, please make sure that it's legible. Well, I'm looking at this screen, not that screen, so it's a lot easier to read up here. Anyway, so I'm going to go ahead and into my plugin, MeetPress, and I'm going to go and look for, let's see, and to be completely honest, I don't remember where the code is. So just a little trick here. If you are looking into a plugin that, come on, don't fail me now, new computer, new laptop problems. All right, let me see here, view, give me 1 second, sorry, appearance, presentation mode should do it for us. Yeah. And then, is that light too bright? I'm totally okay with turning down the lights if it makes it easier for the people in the back to read. Can you just hit that, like flip it to 0 or whatever?
Yeah.
Oh, that helps.
Yes. Yeah, that should be much easier to read. Right, everyone in the back see that?
Yeah.
We good? Okay. So anytime you're looking into a plugin and trying to figure out like what it's doing or whatever, there's always like one main PHP file in the plugin. And in this case, usually the name of that file is just the name of the plugin .php. And then what will happen is all the rest of the work and all the rest of the files for that plugin will spider out from that main file. And so that main file is what I have open here. So this is kind of like what kicks off my whole plugin. A lot of times you'll see this at the top. If you're not sure whether or not the current file you're looking at is the main, like the root plugin file for a plugin, just look for this at the top. If you see that at the top of the file, you know that's the root file. So because I don't know, or I don't remember, where I put the code that does the caching, I'm just going to start here. I'm going to scan through this code real quick, try to see if anything rings any bells, because it's been a while since I've looked at this plugin, to be completely honest. Here's my S214 settings. This is where I'm setting up the settings framework. And what I'm looking for is something that has to do specifically with the meetup API. I do not think this is the right file, and I think the correct file, so you can see all these requires. What all these requires do is they call other PHP files, and I have a feeling that it's probably in, BuddyPress is the name of the plugin that I'm using to do the whole social thing. So if you want to create like a mini social network on WordPress, use BuddyPress. I think I'm going to start at this file right here. I think it might be in there. So we have to unfortunately exit presentation mode and then go back into my files and try to find this file, class meetpress. And actually, I'm not going to keep zooming in until I find the correct file. Boom, there it is. This is the right file. So we'll go back into presentation mode. I wish there was a shortcut for that. I'd probably make one real quick if I really cared. Anyway, so this is the main class for those of you that don't know object-oriented PHP. That's a whole other topic. So just follow along as best you can, I guess. So this is the main class that kind of does all of the cooperation between the Meetup API and our plugin. This is a very common tactic that I use when I'm creating plugins that integrate with third-party APIs. And so anything that helps us communicate with that API is going to go through this class. So you'll see I've got this request access. This request access is a method that gets called sometimes to the API whenever our token that we get from the API has expired. It'll run this method to go get a new token, and now we can communicate with the API again. And it does all that automatically behind the scenes. You don't even have to know what's happening on the, from the admin side of things. But one thing you'll see here, and I'm using it in a couple different places. I don't want to show you too soon. Okay. So here you'll see a method called the muGetterService. And so essentially what the idea behind this little method is I wanted to create a service that is responsible for going to the Meetup API once I've established an authenticated connection and get data from it. Any data. It doesn't matter what endpoint I'm hitting. Whenever I want to get information from the API, I use this service, and then what I do is I pass the endpoint in as an argument so that I use the same method over and over and over and over and over again to just always get data from the API and have it be in a consistent structure every single time I call it. And so what you'll notice when we skim down here is this guy right here, set transient. And notice what's right above it. We've got this variable being created called time, and it goes out to our meet press options and gets this, I guess, sub option. So there's one main option object that gets saved in the database, and then it's a giant array. Actually, it's not an object; it's an associative array. And then each thing that we had set in our settings framework, all those fields are all different pieces of that array. And so what I'm doing in here is I'm saying go get the cache API data value from that thing, from that field, from the settings. And notice how it says times 60. That's because the value that we're allowing the user to enter in the admin area is by the minute. But this thing works by seconds. So I'm just using the code to convert the minutes that they entered in that field to seconds in here so that we can tell this very important function, set transient, how long to save the data that it gets back from Meetup for. So this one function right here does a lot. So let's kind of talk about what it does. And yeah, then we'll go one step further. So set transient takes three main arguments. The first one is the ID of the transient. So the first thing that WordPress needs to know whenever you use set transient is, what is this thing going to be called? We need to give it an ID, like Rob or Eric or whatever, right? Like, what is your ID? And preferably a more specific ID than just Rob, like maybe it'd be Rob-Ruiz, Eric-Swanson, whatever. So we give it an ID, and normally the way you use this is you'll just see a string here. Like somebody will just say, like, I want it to be, oops, gosh, the first time I wrote a string, my transient or something, right? Normally that's what you see when you see set transient, is some name entered in there as a string. But because I'm way too fancy and kind of extra, what I'm doing is I'm saying, okay, we're going to dynamically create the ID for this transient based off of the endpoint that we put in. So, and you can make the ID for this thing basically as long as you want. Well, I'm sure there's a limit, but I've never hit it. I'm sure it's something crazy like 256 characters or something like that. Probably whatever the database allows you to do, now that I think about it, because all these do get stored in the database. But all I'm doing is I'm saying, okay, take the string meetpress underscore API underscore data, and then concatenate it with a string replace of the endpoint. And then I just want you to take any slashes and replace them with dashes, because it doesn't like the slashes in the string or whatever, right? There's probably a bit more I could do there to be safer in terms of the ID that I'm creating, but this is good enough for me. So whatever endpoint I put in there, say it's like slash WP Omaha slash events, right? That's going to get turned into a string called meetpress underscore API underscore data. WP Omaha dash events or something like that, right? But because we're dynamically creating the ID, we don't really have to worry about overwriting other ones, because different calls of the API are going to hit different endpoints. And so anytime we hit a given endpoint, it's always going to be unique, essentially, because the endpoint itself is unique. If we hit the same endpoint twice, we should expect the same data back twice, right? So it makes perfect sense. So we dynamically create our ID, and that satisfies the first argument. The second argument is the value that we want to store. So in this case, our value is just whatever we got back from the API. So what I did was I created another, this is another common design pattern that I use when I communicate with APIs. I will create a request method of some kind. Now sometimes I'll just call it request, because if it's in a class, it's unique anyway. So it'll be that object, arrow function request. But sometimes I like to just like put the, an abbreviation there or something. I don't know. It really doesn't matter either way. In this case, I called it request mu, and this method right here is responsible for making all of my requests to meetup. Period. It doesn't matter if it's a post, if it's a get, it doesn't matter the endpoint, whatever. All of that is dynamically passed in through all these variables, and then it always just returns me the response if it's not an error. If it's anything but a 200, it returns an error. And there's probably a better way to code that too, but again, for all intents and purposes, for this plugin and for our integration with Meetup, we just want to return a WordPress error that tells us more about what the response was in the case that we don't get a 200 back, which 200 typically is a successful response from an API. Now there are other response codes that are considered successful, like 201s and stuff like that, but they're not nearly as prevalent or as common as the 200s. So 200 is good enough for us in this specific situation. So all our getter service is doing is calling to that method with the endpoint that we passed in, and then it does a whole bunch of other stuff behind the scenes, right? Like if we don't have a token, then call the mu access and get a fresh token. But otherwise, just keep it moving. Call the endpoint, give us our data. We take the data that it responds back to us with, we store it in this variable called value, and then that gets stored in the transient. Any questions on that? Cool. And then our time is just whatever we entered into the settings framework. So in the case of the way we have it set on our website right now, you guys probably saw it was set to 10 minutes. So right now what it does is it takes 10 times 60 and then stores it in the transient in terms of seconds. So what'll happen now is whenever we call this getter service, the first thing it's going to do is it's going to attempt to get the data for this endpoint from the transient. So it's going to say, and I'll kind of walk you through this syntax because it is a little tricky. So what we're doing is we're saying, let's create a variable called value from the function getTransient and then our ID. If the result if that variable ends up being false, then we know that the transient has never been set, or at least isn't currently set. Let's put it that way. It may have previously been set, but if it expired or we deleted it, it's gone, we know it's not currently there. So we say if it's false, then that means we need to go ahead and do whatever it takes to go get that data, and then as long as that's not an error, then we want to make sure we set that transient so that the next time we try to get this data, we don't end up going through this whole rigmarole and we don't call the API. We just get the transient, the data from the transient, and then the transient will be what gets returned. Cool? Any questions about that? I'm noticing something. If is W. Oh, I see. Okay. So this is just saying if the transient is considered an error, delete it. I don't think that really needs to be in there. I think that was just while I was developing it, so I could clear out any bad responses I was getting. But I think I just realized that it didn't matter if it was in there or not. It didn't hurt anything. Yes.
So my question is with the line 97, cache control, is that a variable that's specific to the transient ID that somehow gets checked when the cache passes the time?
Good question. No, it's not. This was my own little trick. So all I really added this for was to give myself the ability to clear what's in that cache at any given time by simply putting a query string parameter at the end of any URL in the admin that's called cache control and has the value of clear. So it's mostly there for development purposes. Like if I just wanted to make sure while I'm testing things and while I'm building stuff, if I wanted to make sure that all the transients were gone, then all I had to do was make sure that I added the query string parameter of cache control with the value of clear to the URL I was hitting, and that would force all the transients to get deleted while I'm developing. Does that make sense? Good question. And again, I left the code in there for a couple of reasons. A, like I told you earlier, I haven't deployed this plugin anywhere. When I go to, if I ever go to deploy this plugin and put it out there available for anybody else to use, I'll probably remove some of this other stuff that's kind of in there for me while I'm developing. But it also doesn't hurt anything being in there, because if those query string parameters aren't set, then this never gets called. So this never does anything, so it doesn't matter. Good question though. Yeah, a little sneaky little trick there whenever you need to whenever you need to control what's happening in the back end from the front end with that, and you don't want to create some button or like and make it too complex. If you just want to like have some quick and simple way to like control things, you can use what's in the get global, which is usually coming from the request that the server gets. You can use that to pass data into your code and then force it to do tricky little stuff like that. Anyway, so then what happens after all that, as long as everything is all good, it just returns the value, whether it was stored in the transient or not, is how this ends up working. Cool. Any questions about that? Good. Pretty straightforward, pretty standard, and I will tell you it's, how do I word this? Although it does follow like basically the rules that they created set transient for, this is the type of stuff that transients are for. They're used for caching data. Now, they're not commonly used for caching API data, but we can use them for whatever the heck we want. And so in this case, it works well to use it to cache our data from the API. And this makes everybody happy. It makes our plugin faster because it's a lot faster to get the transient from the server than it is to call the API, wait for a response, and then give them that information. So this helps our server performance, and it also helps our API limit on meetup.com. So that's one way we can use get and set transient and delete transient, and how we can use transients all together. Now, I just wanted to show you this in particular because it's kind of like the only example I have of transients in code that I've written on this computer. I've used transients in a great number of other ways, but this is the only example I have on my computer readily available to show. And that was kind of the purpose of creating the wpOmaha.org website anyway. The idea was it would be a very useful tool to use during meetups, so that we kind of A, have a website for everybody to go to and use, but B, also have a sandbox for us to kind of play in and create stuff of our own and throw it in this website and be able to use it to show off and stuff like that. So now, anybody have any other ideas of other information and data that we could store in a transient that might speed up our site? No? Okay. I will tell you the most common use case for get transient. For those that don't understand how PHP works, what happens when we write PHP, and actually now might be a good time to look at like some like template code essentially. looking for some HTML. There's some HTML. It's not a lot of HTML though. Alright, well, just to keep things speedy, I'm going to go ahead and just use this as an example, although it's not a very good example. Just use your imaginations and roll with me here. So what this function right here does, the meet press register with meetup button, is it renders that button that you guys saw in the settings area. So all it does is echo a bunch of HTML onto the page for us. Now this isn't very much HTML, so it's not particularly difficult or expensive for the server to go ahead and do this for us. But you can imagine a situation where, say, we need to query WordPress for a bunch of posts, and then we want to list all of those posts on WordPress in a specific fashion, maybe with each one's featured image, and also let's say it's a particularly difficult query to run because we've got a bunch of conditionals that run in the background. Like, let's say, oh, well, we only want, so perform the query, and then we only want like the most recent 5 posts that are from the category of featured or something like that, right? You can see how things can progressively, as you keep narrowing down your query, things can get expensive, right? You can, like, you know, say, oh, well, I only want the featured ones, and it's in the posts, but there's like 1,000 posts, maybe 100,000 posts in our WordPress site, and I don't want to have to do, and let's say this has to be shown on the home page, right? So what you don't want to do is you don't want your first page that people load for your website all the time to be slow, because that's going to have the most detrimental impact on your SEO, because that's the page that most people are going to hit on your website. So what you want is, okay, well, we want to be able to show the most recent 5 featured posts out of thousands or hundreds of thousands of posts on the home page, but we don't want it to have to run that query every single time the home page is hit, because of what that means is that every single time somebody hits the home page, WP query is getting called. That means it's calling the database. That means it's coming through all of your posts, and it's getting back, who knows, maybe 100,000 posts, and then after you get all those back, you're having to go through all those posts and say, okay, now find me, loop through all these posts and give me the first 5 that you find that have the category of feature or something like that. Now, with that said, for people that are savvy with WordPress development, before you start thinking to yourself, well, Rob, you know, the WP query class allows you to query by metadata, so you don't really have to do it like that. Just roll with me here. I understand that. I know that with WP query, you can pass it metadata and you can do meta queries, and we can make it so that it doesn't return 100,000 posts. It only returns our featured ones, but let's just pretend that doesn't exist. Bottom line is, we want to only have to perform this laborious action of querying the database for a bunch of information every once in a while, so that usually, like 99% of the time when people visit our homepage, it's not having to perform that query over and over and over and over again. It only has to perform it once, every once in a while, kind of like what we were doing when we were limiting our caching calls. So what you could do is you can render the results of your post with your HTML and everything all into one big transient, and then call the transient a lot like what we did in our plugin code. We check to see if the transient's set. If it's not set, we perform the query, we construct the HTML, and then we spit it out to the page, right? But if it is set, we just get the string of HTML from the transient and display it on the page, which dramatically speeds up the homepage of our site and gives you instant gains. Now, obviously, depending on the amount of posts you have, the gains will vary, but let's just say, for the sake of argument here, we've got hundreds of thousands of posts, and this thing is going to reduce our page load time on the home page by like probably a solid 2 or 3 seconds, which is a lot. So that's probably the most common use case for a transient. Now, there's a few ways to do this, and I'm not gonna like live demo this because if I try to do it, no doubt about it, it's not gonna work right. Because I've been in this situation many a times before. This is not my first talk, and I'll sit here and you guys will sit here and watch me code for a while, and then I'll hit enter and we'll try to run, and then it'll break, and then I'll be like, oh, sorry guys. So I'm not gonna do that. However, what I am gonna do is I will show you a neat little tool in PHP, not WordPress, that allows us to do something kind of cool when it comes to rendering HTML. So, oh my gosh, I did it again. Sorry guys. I'm gonna have to find some kind of patch for this mouse pad and the driver or something. It's really annoying. Okay, let's go back to this guy. All right, so so there's a cool thing called the obcache in PHP, but if you just look up obcache PHP, it's not really going to come up because it's not actually called obcache. What it's going to give you is obstart. So what does OB stand for? It's actually not object like you would think. What it actually stands for is output buffer. And so what the output buffer allows you to do in PHP is it essentially allows you to like render a whole bunch of HTML and then compose it all into one big like buffer stream thing, and then you can store that in the transient. And this comes particularly useful when it comes to stuff that's dynamically created. So like this is a pretty simple example here. But what's happening here is they're saying, okay, when we perform this callback, return this string, and all they're doing here is they're replacing oranges with apples. Yeah. And then they say obstart callback, and it calls the callback function, and basically whatever our function returns gets put into the buffer. And then if we say, hey, give me what's in the buffer, you get all this. And so it does this thing, or whatever. So, I don't know, does everybody kind of understand what's going on here?
I've used it before.
You have? Great, yeah. It's been around in PHP for a long time. There's not really like a wrapper or anything in WordPress to like, I don't know, do this a WordPress way per se, because the WordPress way of doing this is exactly the same as the PHP way of doing this. So, if you want to see something interesting, I will clue you into...
Just make sure you run the OBN flush.
Yes, good point. Thank you, yes. Run the OBN flush. There's actually a couple of different ways to do that. There's actually an OB get and flush or something like that function that kind of like does 2-in-1 that's more popular. But anyway, what I was going to look up was WordCamp Omaha YouTube. And the reason I'm doing this is not just for shameless self-promotion. It's because I just happen to know, because I was at WordCamp Omaha 2016. If you go to the WordPress Omaha 2016, I hope it's in here. Pretty sure it is in here. My friend Will, that some people here may or may not know. Will, what's his last name? Will, he used to work at Flywheel.
You did? Oh, Will,
What's Will's last name? Help me out.
Riley.
Riley.
Yep.
Will Riley, very talented developer, very smart individual, did a great talk at this WordCamp about how he created this theme for Grain and Mortar that was extremely performant, and the whole talk was about exactly this, how he used the obcache system, and essentially he made his own template or his own theme that loaded extremely quickly, because he knew that the homepage was always going to be the same because it's basically a static homepage, but it had a whole bunch of crazy stuff on it. Like it had a video that played and like a bunch of images and all this stuff, and he noticed that it took a really long time for this homepage to render, and so he shows off in this talk. I think it is this one. I want to say it's this one.
Hi everyone, my name is William Riley.
That is him, yes. So it is this talk, server-side performance from WordCamp Omaha 2016. And he goes through, and this is where I first learned about transients. And it blew my mind. And so here you go. You can see he's doing it right here. He does a query and get contents and the clean and the whole 9 yards. And he shows off the website that he created and some code he has on GitHub that you can grab. Yeah. And so he was able to speed up the homepage of the Grain and Mortar website dramatically by using this specific trick. So feel free to go watch this video on your own. It's actually quite entertaining. He's a very interesting individual, very smart, and yeah, you'll learn essentially the more common way that people use transients with WordPress to improve page load time. And this is, now I can't guarantee you with 100% certainty that this is how it works with plugins like WP Rocket and like, is that what it's called, or what are the?
Yeah, there's WP Rocket, there's Jetpack.
Yeah, there's a bunch of like speed up your WordPress site with plugins. W3 Total Cache is a big one.
They save everything to file. Work WT, that total cache.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
I'm pretty sure they do some of that, but I would be very surprised to find out that they're not using transients in some situations in the back end of that. Now again, I haven't dug through the code for W3 Total Cache or anything like that, so I can't tell you with 100% certainty that that's exactly what's happening, but I would be very surprised if there's not at least a few set transients in there.
I kind of doubt it because I have WP total cache running on my website, and I back it up and I don't see many transients there. But I could be wrong.
You mean in the database?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I don't. Like I said, I'm not 100% sure, but I've heard of people doing it this way before, and it's a very common technique. Is all I'm trying to say. Now, there's obviously other ways of doing it that are a little bit more robust and sophisticated, like writing files to disk. They create a cache folder in your WP content directory, and it stores files in there, and they have their own database table sometimes that they create where they load stuff in there or whatever. When you're creating a plugin, you do anything you want. So there are other ways, other tricks to like storing data or caching data or whatever. Now, when it comes to storing stuff in the database in a very custom way, you're probably going to end up using the wpdb class to do that type of thing. We can go into that if you want, but that's kind of a broader topic that you can use for a lot of stuff besides just storing cached buffer data in there or whatever, like giant blobs and strings of HTML or whatever you just want rapid access at. But yeah, that's how that happens, is using the wpdb class.
So the gist is he basically just turned every potential page into an object and then just cache the objects?
No, again, don't get confused by
Okay.
the name ob_start. It's not short for object.
Okay.
It's output buffer.
Okay.
So he's creating a buffer. So think of a buffer as like everybody knows nowadays when you're watching like live events on TV, they're not actually live.
Right.
You're not watching them live anymore, thanks to people like Justin Timberlake and Janet Jackson screwing it up for everybody. So now they've got like this delay, essentially. Like whatever you see on live TV is delayed by like 5 or 10 seconds, so that if a nipple slips or something crazy like that, they can like get in there and try to fix it real quick before it ends up going out to like hundreds of millions of people or whatever, right? Same thing for like cursing. If they want the ability to like on live TV or whatever, like the morning show or something, right? Like they want to be able to like bleep people when they're talking or whatever for censorship reasons. They've got this like 5 or 10 second window where they can jump in there and put a bleep over something real quick before it gets put out. That's what I'm talking about when we talk about a buffer. Is it's like taking all of the the resultant HTML and it pushes it into this buffer, and then this buffer gives you like this kind of wiggle room or play room where you can do things to it between the time that it gets generated and the time that it gets put onto the page or echoed out to the page. So think of it more like that, because that's a more accurate way of thinking about it, a more accurate description. And all we're doing is so what's happening in that in-between window is instead of like editing it or censoring it or whatever, we're just like taking a snapshot of it, like a copy of it, and we're like storing it somewhere in the database or whatever. Good question though. Any other questions about object cache or transients or anything like that? And obviously, you don't have to store it in a transient, but transients are very convenient. Other things I've used transients for is like storing like user tokens, right? Since tokens are usually only good for an X amount of time, let's say a user logs into a system, and once they've logged in, they get like a token of some kind. You can sometimes store your user's token in the transient and just make it like, you know, user dash the user's ID dash token or something, and then that will allow you to be able to get at that user's token at any time, having it stored on the website and only for X amount of time, and then you just intelligently set the expire time, I don't know, like a few seconds, 10 seconds, 20 seconds, 100 seconds, whatever, prior to the expiration time that you got from the API. Because a lot of times when you get a token from an API, this is basic OAuth stuff, you'll get like an expiration time from the API. It'll give you a token, it'll give you a refresh token, it'll give you an expires time, and that's usually about it. So what you can do is you can use that expires time they give you to calculate the expire time you want for your transient. And you can store your transient temporarily on the server, which is actually a lot safer than keeping it on the client side. So it becomes a nice little tool in that situation for more than just caching stuff. It almost becomes like a secret storage spot that you can use. Cool. Any questions about transients? Questions about obcache? I had a feeling today would turn into more of like a AMA thing after a while, so I'm totally prepared for that. I didn't want this talk to take up like a whole hour and a half or 2 hours or whatever, because doing things performant is fairly simple and straightforward. Now, what I did plan on doing was talking about a few use cases that I've been in recently that unfortunately I don't really have a visual for. So I'll just put code up on the screen because that makes it look like I'm talking about something important. While I talk about this, but just know that what I'm talking about right now doesn't really relate to this code here. Because it's code that I wrote for my work. I do have it on this laptop right here, but I don't feel like switching it out, and this whole thing is run off the stream. And anyway, so the situation I've been in recently. I work for Proxybid. We have an API that gives us inventory data. And actually, since we're not really like looking at this code, would you mind like bumping that light up to like 25% or whatever again, or 50? Yeah, just so it's not so dark in here. Okay, so my plugin goes out to our API and it gets the inventory data for a auction house, right? And so they use this system that we have called WaveBid to manage the inventory for their auction. And then they want that inventory listed on their website. So my job at Proxybid is to build this plugin that essentially does that. And it goes to WaveBid, gets the inventory data, automatically generates a bunch of posts in WordPress based off of the inventory data on their WordPress site, so that we can create kind of like the ultimate white label solution for their auction house. So instead of like saying, okay, boom, here's, like right now what it is like xyzauctionhouse.com. It's a WordPress site, but whenever they want to look at inventory or whenever they want to interact with the stuff, like bid on it or register to bid on it or see the pricing or whatever, right? Whenever they want to do any of that stuff, they have to go to proxybid.com. They don't get to stay on xyzauctionhouse.com, right? So what this effort is the attempt to take all the data from our system and migrate it into their WordPress so that we can create this ultimate white label experience, and so that when people Google for any of the stuff that's in their inventory, like say tractors or firearms or whatever the stuff this auction house is selling, they come across the page on the XYZ auctionhouse.com website instead of on proxybid.com website. So thanks to WordPress and permalinks and post structure and all that stuff, by automatically generating posts for all of the things in their inventory, WordPress kind of automatically creates this perfect SEO environment where when people Google for the stuff that they're trying to get on auction, they come across these pages on xyzauctionhouse.com that are automatically created from our API. So there's no manual entry by the auction house whatsoever. They just load up their website, and every time they go to their inventory management system that belongs to us to do all their inventory stuff, which they have to do anyway in order for the bidding and all that stuff to happen, right? Instead of having to do that multiple times, they don't have to do it in one place, which is in this inventory system. And then this WordPress plugin that I've been working on is responsible for hitting the API, checking for new stuff, and then automatically building in mass auctions and lots that are associated to auctions, and displaying them on pages and allowing you to like filter them all and search for them and all this stuff, right? But the trick is, because we don't have the WaveBid system, that WaveBid system doesn't have the ability to just tell WordPress when something's been updated. What my plugin has to do is hit the API every X amount of minutes on a cron job and check for new stuff, right? And it was this sync process that was taking us a really, really long time. So every 5 minutes or so, which is what we have the cron job set to, the website would slow down dramatically while it's performing this sync in the background. So if you were the unlucky person to go to the website while it was performing this sync every 5 minutes, you would wait for a minute, 2 minutes sometimes for a web page to load, which is obviously no bueno. So what I had to do was go through all my code and try to find ways to optimize the code and figure out what's taking so long and how I can make it take less time, or at least chunk it up so it didn't have to do it all at once, essentially. And what I found is my WP query was just all jacked up. It was coming back with all of the past auctions and all of the upcoming auctions, when really the most important thing that we care about keeping up to date, like every 5 minutes or mostly real time, is the upcoming stuff, right? Not auctions that have already passed and is like historical archival data, right? But my WP query wasn't written properly, and it was pulling all of the auctions, which was 85% past auctions. So every time I was performing the sync, it was querying all of those auctions, and it was calling the API for all the data for all those auctions and constantly updating all the data, even though the data was never changing because it was some old auction that hasn't, that's passed and nobody's even done anything. Nobody's ever going to do anything with it again. So it's always a good idea to go back through your code, comb through it, and look at exactly what's doing. And I have a little trick for that that I will share with you. And it's kind of one of my best friends now. So what I used to do is I used to create like pages and page templates that like spit stuff out on the page using print R and echo when I'm troubleshooting stuff, which is not the best way to do it. What is a better way to do it, I gotta stop clicking on this mouse pad, it's gonna drive me crazy, is a handy little function you can write into your WordPress plugin that looks like this. So it's not a function that's built into WordPress. Here, let me there we go. So it's not a function that's built into WordPress. But what I'll typically do when I'm working on a plugin, especially a plugin that I know I'm going to be spending a lot of time on, and it's for like a big company, and this is like, an enterprise level plugin, is one of the first things I'll do when I create the plugin is write in the main plugin file, I will write this bit of code here. And what this allows me to do, especially when I'm using local by Flywheel, is is I can just simply stick write log anywhere in my code. And what'll happen is it'll take whatever I put inside of what I want to be logged, and it'll wrap it nicely using the print R function if it's an array, which is commonly the case for me, and it'll write it into the PHP error logs that can be found if you're using local, which in this case I am. Under the name of your site, logs, PHP, and here's our error log, which probably has a bunch. Oh, actually, it doesn't have that much stuff in there. Yeah, I thought it was going to be like thousands of lines log or something. But yeah, so what you could do is you can simply write log and then keep this file open. And anytime you go to this file, it'll just show you whatever you wanted to see.
It's like a poor man's console, basically.
Exactly. But the reason why I say it's important to use write log is because it's common for me to want to put an array in here. And the reason why it's common for me to want to put an array in here is because I'll usually put the very first item of the array, I'll make it a string. And the string will just be whatever the heck it is that I'm logging, because I need a way to identify, because sometimes I'm logging stuff from like 5 or 6 places, depending on how much I'm pulling out my hair at the time. I might be writing log in 20 different places because I don't know what the hell's going on in the background, right? So I have to make it an array so that I can make the string, the very first thing in that array, a clue to myself as to where in the code this log is being written at. So it'll say something like testing WP query during the data sync or something, right? And then that'll be the first element in the array, and then everything in the array after that will be data that's in my code that I don't know what's being, I don't know what the values of those variables are, because they don't end up getting spit out onto a page anywhere ever. So and then when it's an array, you can put as many of those as you want in there. You can put like 1 value or 2 values or 20 values in there, and some of those values are going to be strings, some of those values are going to be arrays, some of those values are going to be objects. And the way it wraps that print R in the background makes it very easy to troubleshoot. It's this part, right? So PHP has an error log function built into it, so this error log is just part of PHP, but it doesn't automatically do this type of a thing where it converts it into a print R so that it looks pretty in the log. Otherwise, what you end up with is some giant string of crap that's very difficult to read. The print R makes it so that, at the end of where it says object, it breaks into another line and it shows you the first part of the object, and then every part of the object is on a new line break and stuff. So it makes it really easy to read these things that you're writing to the log. So that's my little tip. And so I use this quite a bit, and this little trick here is what shined the light on my performance issue in my plugin that I just had to fix last week. And the sync time went dramatically from like a minute down to like 5 seconds or something like that. And so, yay, saved the day, right?
Next.
Yep.
Right.
Yeah. So it's very important to make sure you're testing your stuff and make sure your queries are working, because that will cause a problem. This is a nice way to identify memory leaks. This is a nice way to identify infinite loops, which can totally happen in some situations when you're programming, which will obviously seem like a performance problem, especially when PHP crashes and just straight shuts your site down, which luckily that's another thing that local is good for, is it'll do that relatively quickly. It'll just straight, oh, your site's crashed, but luckily it's only local, and it'll tell you why it crashed and all that.
And where's the ideal place to paste this then?
In your main plugin file. So if I was to do it in, like if I wanted to put this in the MeetPress plugin, I would go into here, and I would open our main MeetPress file, which is right here, and actually I already have it in here.
Nice.
There it is, right there. And so now, if I ever want to spit data out into the log, I could just anywhere in my code, even if it's not in my plugin, I can actually put write log in other plugins if I want. So if I want to figure out what's going on in the background of some plugin, at any point in time in their code, I could just go shove write log in there when I'm developing locally, obviously, and have it tell me exactly what the data is in the variables, so that I can troubleshoot things and figure out what's going on and find ways to optimize and so on and so forth.
Excuse my language, that's fucking awesome.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a cool trick. Cool trick. So write log, do it. Do the write log. Any other questions? We've got 30 minutes left. Ask me anything. It doesn't even have to be about performance. It could be about anything WordPress.
Do you ever use Xdebug then?
Xdebug?
Yeah, the debugger.
You mean like the thing that's built into WordPress that you turn on in the WP
It's not
config?
WordPress, it's PHP. It's a debugger where you can run it. It communicates with the front end, and then you can have breakpoints and stop.
Oh, you're talking about the thing that's built into the lamp stack that gives you those tables with the
Yeah.
orange headers and whatnot?
Well, you can stop the code in the editor because your editor, like VS Code, has I think there's a plugin for it with Xdebug, so that you can connect the two and then set breakpoints in the VS Code. And
Yeah, you could do it in PHP Storm too. I think that's what this is designed for right here.
yeah, there's a little setup you have to do for the client or for the website.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure.
Website side,
So
so that they'll communicate with
to
each other.
answer your question, no,
Oh, okay.
it's not really part of my workflow. I've never done it.
It's awesome. If you can get it to work, it takes a little bit to get it set up, but if you can get it to work, then you can just step through your code. And,
Right, and you can just
then
put
you can-
breakpoints like that and
yeah,
that
then
and
you
that,
can go
right?
and look at
And it'll
your
stop
arrays.
whatever it's doing, and you can hover over the text, and it'll. Yeah. When I was doing .NET development and a lot of JavaScript development, I would do it that way. However, I find it easier for me to do that in the browser. I don't know if you know this, but you could do that in the browser too.
Well, that's for JavaScript.
Yeah.
Not PHP.
Correct. That's what I was talking
But
about.
you can do this with PHP, which I used to be a C++ for 25 years.
Right.
So I used debugger. So
Yeah, I've never gone through the trouble of setting up the local debugger for PHP, especially for PHP Storm. It's probably pretty cool, but it's really fast and easy for me to slap write log in there. And as a matter of fact, I have a shortcut for it to just spit it on the page for me.
I mean, you can.
And then I just copy and paste whatever I want in there.
Too,
Yeah.
which is huge.
Yeah. I don't know. Maybe one day I'll get around to trying that out and seeing if it benefits my workflow, and it's very likely that it would, maybe in some ways.
sometimes you just want to know, is it hitting this function in this class?
Right.
Just which function is this happening in? So you just throw every single function. You tell it
Breakpoint. Yeah.
Stop whenever it goes into any of these functions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I don't know. I would be interested to see somebody else show that off with PHP Storm. Wink, wink.
I don't use PHP Storm, but with VS Code.
I just know that when PHP breaks on most websites, it shows on the actual website, the stat trace, the line, break.
Not always.
If you have debug on,
Yeah, if you have WP debug turned on, which is located,
WP
which for some reason I can't find in here.
config.
I probably didn't grab it down from the server. That's probably why. But yeah, anyway, there should be, now that I'm thinking about it, I'm interested to see if I've set up my deployment configuration. Oh, I haven't. That sucks. Anyway, yeah, in the wp-config.php file in the root of WordPress, you have to set that to, there's a wp_debug global variable, and you have to set that to true in order for that to happen. And ideally, on a production WordPress site, you should not have that set to true. Which is why in Flywheel, they don't even give you access to the config. They just give you some GUI that you can click WP debug and sit there and wait for 45 seconds for it to actually switch the files out or write something to the file, know what they do behind the scenes, the little Ruby magic they do there. But yeah, I'm guessing it switches out with another file that has WP debug set to true in there, and then you see all of your stuff on there. But yeah, no production website should ever have WP debug set to true. If anything breaks in the background, you want it to stay in the background. You don't want it to advertise to all the people that are visiting your
Sometimes
website.
it's not even stuff that's broken, it's just ugly.
Yeah, sometimes it's just notices or warnings, right? The only things that'll actually break your website are the fatal errors, and so, yeah. But most times it's like, oh, you tried to call some element in an array that doesn't exist or something, and it's like a warning or a notice or whatever, and it'll spit it out all over the page, all ugly like, yeah. Any other questions about anything at all? Some of you, I mean, I'm interested to know why some of you came. If you don't have questions about it.
I had the day off, and then I saw the Twitter notification. I was like, "This is the perfect storm." Like,
Yeah, but theoretically, I would think that Flywheel would be more than happy to let you leave work 2 hours early on a Friday to attend a
according to the
meetup.
needs of support. So.
Oh, yeah, true.
so that's probably a hell no.
Sad that there's no Flywheel developers here, but I do know that none of the Flywheel developers actually do WordPress development, so not surprising that they're not here, I guess. But there are a lot of companies around Omaha that do WordPress development that are not here, and so that's why our goal for 2020 for the Dev Meetup is to get more working professionals to this meetup. We'll see what happens. It probably won't work, but I'm going to give it my damnedest try.
That's the sad part, it should.
You would think.
Yeah.
Like companies like Bozell, I know, do a lot of WordPress development,
Right.
and Buildertrend does a little now. I know Peter Kiewit does some WordPress stuff. AIM does WordPress stuff. Yeah, I keep my ear to the streets. I know who does what. Secret Penguin,
And
they
we
use
can imagine
WordPress
how
quite a
productive
bit.
They are at their office right now between 3 to 5 on a Friday.
Right, they're not doing anything. They're sitting around drinking beer right now, I guarantee it. Which is why we need to have beer at this meetup, man. Yeah. Yes?
I have a basic question. How is the best way to check the speed and like how optimized is your website?
Sure.
Because I've tried different ways and the scores are different, you know, they give me different stuff. So I never know which one's the accurate, you know.
Like I said at the beginning, we're going to go over a lot of that in the meetup
On the 30th.
at the end of the month.
On the 30th.
Yeah. But I'll give you a sneak peek now. I got no problem with that since nobody else has any questions. GTmetrics.com is kind of like, I don't know, the industry standard, I guess. Make sure that when you do this, though, you always put a trailing backslash at the end so that you don't get the 301 redirect in your waterfall. Our score probably isn't going to be very good on this website. I'm not going to lie. I haven't really done a whole lot of optimization to it. I think W3 Total Cache is installed, but yeah. So I've got some C's. You know, it would be nice if it was less than a second for the page load time. Like I said, so few people go to that website. I'm not super concerned with a 2-second load time. It's obviously slower than I would like. You know, like if a company asked me to do a website for them, like if they were a client or whatever of mine, I would make sure that their load time is much lower than 2 seconds. But for something like this, where it's just a community website or whatever, I don't really care that much. We could go to another website that I've developed. I'm actually interested to see what.
GTmetrics the one I stick with it, but I was not sure if that was the best way to do it. So.
I'm interested to see what this comes back with. I haven't maintained this site for quite some time, but I'm just curious to see what the number is. So this is like, I built this website probably 4 or 5 years ago. It's kind of like my magnum opus that has a ton of custom plugins in it. Ooh. See what happens when you let your main web developer leave? That was down to like 0.7 seconds when I left there. But obviously they have since defiled my work. So yeah. But yeah, this is what I would use. The waterfall here is the big telltale of what's going on. You can see what you kind of want to look for is these big gray bars, like these. Those are no bueno. Now some of these you can't do a whole lot about, like some of this stuff, the teal bars, that's because it's blocked. Can't really do a whole lot about that. And my goodness, look at the amount of scripts that are here. There's a lot going on there, and yeah. Looks like they've got some third-party CSS in here that's taking a really long time. Some reCAPTCHA getting loaded twice for some reason. Some
Double
styles.
protection, Rob.
Yeah.
Double protection.
Yeah, I don't know.
Running at once.
It's just no good all the way around. But with that said, the website for the most part is pretty snappy because they're on a really good server. There are some articles out there about how to like build your own super fast server, especially for WordPress in particular, but they're not on some fancy managed hosting platform like Flywheel. Flywheel's okay for right out of the box in terms of speed, but not the best. The fastest instance I've ever built is a custom instance on DigitalOcean using ServerPilot. And what you can do is you can use Nginx as a proxy to act as a load balancer for Apache. And when you can, but this all requires you to like administrate your own Linux box. So you have to SSH into the Linux box and install all sorts of server-side caching plugins, and you have to configure it like this very specific way to get it lightning fast. But that is a lot of work. It's not for the faint of heart at all. You can Google articles. There's plenty of them. So if we just typed in like, let's see, DigitalOcean fastest WordPress. Yeah, right here. This guy right here.
How much does that cost a month?
Actually, DigitalOcean is super cheap. If you've never looked into DigitalOcean, it is a very convenient thing. Oh yeah, look at this. This is what we want right here. Oh yeah, look at all that text. So yeah, you just go through this step by step. It is not a short blog post by any stretch of the imagination.
So you're saying it uses Nginx and Apache at the same time?
Yes.
So you're basically responsible for maintaining those two setups too.
Correct. Yeah.
So
And you have to do a lot of Linux command line
it's
stuff.
running on the same server though, so it's like, why would you not use, for instance, Nginx, just Nginx?
Because, and I could be wrong about this. I don't know. I just followed a step-by-step blog post that told me how to do it, and that's how they did it, and it worked great. I mean, it was so great, and it was so fast that I thought something was broken. That's how fast it was after I got done making it. My guess is that you can't run two separate instances of Nginx on the same server. Like, I don't think you could just spin up 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 instances of Nginx all willy-nilly like that. I think you can only have one. And so I think the idea is that you use Nginx as a load balancer, not as the main like server essentially, and then it like hands off the workload to Apache, acts as like a middleman and speeds things up, and uses, I believe it's PHPFPM or something like that, or memcached or something that you install. It's like a Linux, I don't know, a Linux caching system where it'll like check the caching system and just throw you what's cached in certain situations, or other times it'll shoot you off to Apache for more robust processes. If that makes any sense. But it's pretty BA, and so if you ever want to play, like, at least that's the fastest WordPress instance I've ever created. Like, again, so fast where I thought it was broken. Like I was just clicking on things and it was just instantaneous, and I was like, is this real life right now? And like, it was real life. And I've heard other people talk about this too, so it's not just me being crazy. Like, I've been to, I think it was at WordCamp KC a few years back, and I was in a conversation with somebody who did the same exact thing. So you can use this thing called ServerPilot, which is what I used in my case. Yeah, this guy. So you set up ServerPilot with a DigitalOcean droplet built on Ubuntu, and yeah, you go through this like step-by-step thing where Server Pilot goes through the beginning process of like building your like, I guess like initial instance of Linux and all that. And, like it kind of gives you a starting point, Server Pilot will itself, and then you go in and like tweak it a little bit. And you go to the command line and tweak it and change some files and put the Nginx in there and like tell it how to route the traffic and all this stuff, and then you get lightning fast WordPress. Pretty cool stuff. I thought about doing a talk on specifically that workflow once because it is so freaking like effective, but it would be an extremely boring talk. You guys would definitely fall asleep. There's no doubt about it. It's not exciting. The results are super exciting, but the process of getting there is, yeah, big snoozer. Any other questions about anything? GT metrics is the way to go to answer your question. I wouldn't go with anything else. You just got to know how to read what you get back, huh?
Where did you get the website that had all that Linux, the information on how to set that up?
I just Googled it. I just Googled.
Fastest DigitalOcean, fastest WordPress?
This one right here is on WP Intense, dated October 20th of 2018. I don't know if this one in particular talks about Server Pilot. I don't think it does. But you could also Google like Ubuntu Server Pilot. DigitalOcean fastest WordPress, something like that. Yeah.
Got it, thanks.
Yeah, you're going to find quite a few articles about it out there. It's really cool. And if you've never used DigitalOcean before, it's awesome. However, it is not for
it's not for
the basic people.
Yeah.
Well, I have my own server at home that I have WordPress.
Oh yeah. I'm sure you probably know your way around Linux. So it would be a cool tool for somebody like you.
Right, I just haven't done it on DigitalOcean, but that looked like a good idea I need to upgrade my server, so.
I think you would really like. If you dove into DigitalOcean, you'd be like, ooh, this is sexy. Because with the way they handle the droplets, you can like spin them up and tear them down relatively quickly, and they charge you by the minute. And it's like 0.0006 cents per minute or something like that. So even to leave one up for like a month or something would only cost you like, I don't know, $7 or something like that. Like,
Okay.
yeah.
Because I have a couple websites that I'd like to get moved off of shared hosting. And if I did something like that, I was wondering how much, how much more expensive it would be since I'm paying for it.
Yeah, well, I mean, the nice thing is that it's in the cloud, and if you use Server Pilot, they will do automatic backups for you, and it gives you the added flexibility that people like Flywheel don't give you, which is being able to install your own stuff on that box in addition to WordPress or whatever.
You're welcome
So,
to blow it up. They won't help you fix it.
right, exactly, yeah.
It's kind of like it's still shared hosting. So it's still shared. It's not on your server in the house, but it's still on the cloud.
Well, it's VPN, right? More like a VPN.
Well, kind of, but it is like technically cloud, which
But it's your own area. I mean,
not a
there's no
VPN,
way-
VPS, I think is what you mean, right?
Yeah.
VPS, yes.
Yeah.
Virtual private server.
Yeah. But it's essentially a network of virtual private servers. I don't think you're like, it's not like your typical, it's not like if you go to like Rackspace or something and purchase a VPS from there, right? It's not quite the same type of thing.
But you're not getting your own machine.
Right. It's not like there's some box somewhere that like has your name on it or something.
Right.
Like it's kind of like a network of boxes that are kind of all working together to balance the load and stuff.
Which is kind of what a VPS is. Because otherwise you're getting your own server.
Well, no, not necessarily, because you can. There's software out there where you can, on a box, have a bunch of servers on the one box, and so technically that's considered a VPS
Right.
because it is virtual, even though it's only on one box.
Right.
What I'm talking about is like distributed load across many boxes.
Okay.
You see what I'm saying? So that they're all like interconnected, and so like some of your data's on this box, some of your data's on that box, on little mini VPSs on each box.
Right.
That's how
They're not-
true cloud works.
But it's not like a shared hosting where you're got 50 people on one machine.
No, no, because you have your own. You have your own specific instance of like MySQL. Like, so you got your own database, your own file system. Usually, your own Docker container is kind of what's going on behind the
So
scenes
when you
there.
get in there,
Buzzwords
it's your
like
own,
Kubernetes.
you kind of feel like
Yes.
it's your own private area. It's not
Correct.
just a user ID.
Yeah, usually it's managed by Kubernetes. Yeah,
They're
absolutely.
your dedicated resources as well, too.
Right.
So
Right.
you're not sharing per se.
Right.
We haven't figured out a way for you to share yet. Put it that way.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
As an aside, or sort of to add to a little bit, I see several pilot runs with Google Cloud. GCP is running a promo right now. They're trying to up their market share, and so they're giving away, like for a new account with Google platform, it's something silly, like essentially they're giving away roughly a year worth of service.
Oh, wow.
Just as a, like, we want to open the floodgates. Yeah, it's an enormous.
Yeah, Amazon does something like that too, but it's not for like a year. I think it's like
Yeah.
for like a couple months or something like
It
that.
could be a year.
Really?
Yeah.
Amazon?
Yeah. I did my year and then they start charging.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, GCP is doing the same thing.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, good stuff.
It
Okay,
can
that's
work
good to
pretty
know.
slick with Docker.
Yeah. And I actually, so on this topic, not to turn this whole topic into like how to set up your own fancy hosting for your WordPress site without using a flywheel.
So,
But
Rob said the type.
shh, quiet, Nathan. So I found a video the other day that was Google Cloud WordPress hosting cheap or something. I think it'll probably come up at the top because I liked it and all that. Yes. So watch this video right here. First of all, this Chris Titus Tech, he's awesome. And
What I learned later.
in this video, he walks you through how you can set up. What just happened? I just clicked on the wrong thing because I pressed down on the mouse pad like I said I wasn't going to do anymore.
Are you sick of paying for web hosting?
Yeah, so watch this video. I've actually watched it in its entirety already. He steps you through the step-by-step process of doing exactly what he was just talking about, which is getting a Google Cloud account, spinning up your own Docker instance with WordPress on there, and essentially you could have free hosting for a year if you're willing to go through. I mean, it takes this dude 30 minutes to do it, so I don't know. You want to take 30 minutes.
Expecting like just a violent amount of traffic for a month, you can also use your credit for, you know, just an enormous pile of
Yeah, yeah. And in this video, he talks about how even after the first year, like he calculated like how much it's costing him, and it's costing him something stupid like $3 or $4 a month or something to have his website up. And that's only because it went up in traffic, like you just said. Like he ended up getting a bunch more traffic, and even with all the traffic, it's still $3 to $4 a month, which is kind of crazy. But again, it's all self-managed, so you have to manage that thing yourself. You can't just, there's no customer support. You can't, it's not for the faint of heart. But somebody like you would totally benefit from it. Cool. Any other questions? Ideas for this group? So I think it was last June, I sent out an email to the whole group saying like, I'm not going to keep organizing this group for the rest of my life. And I told people it had till the end of the year to find somebody else to lead it. Obviously, I did not follow through on the promise of quitting this after the end of the year.
That's Uncle Rob.
But I am hoping that somebody else steps up and is willing to take this thing over soon. I will always be willing to do talks, but I will admit that as long as I continue to have to do all the talks, and as long as I'm the only person organizing this group, the quality of these talks is going to basically be what you got today. I'm not going to spend 2 or 3 hours creating this fancy slideshow and having this whole like grand architected, beautiful talk experience that I can take to, go speak at WordCamp US or something with, or whatever, right? It just doesn't make sense for me to invest that much time into it. I'm always willing to come in here and share what knowledge I have with everybody and help people out. But yeah, if you guys want better quality talks out of me, I need more help, people. Yeah, until that happens, it's going to be pretty much winging it when I come in here and do this. So I'm going to keep it running, though. I'm going to keep it going. I'm not going to let it fail. I don't know what's going to happen with WordCamp, though. That's out of my hands. I don't know what to do about that. That's still yet to be decided.
I wasn't even aware that there were many WordPress professional developers that existed, first of all, until I came here, and then around the Omaha area.
Well, somebody's got to be making all these plugins, right? And WordPress is an open source project, so somebody must be contributing to it in order for us to continue to get updates.
Stuff might not even be on the place where I get my plugins.
Yeah, I don't know. There's a lot of WordPress developers out there. I mean, there's a lot of WordPress developers in Omaha. I don't know why they don't come to this meetup, but yeah, it's gotten to the point now where I just have no shame in putting Josh Collinsworth's Twitter tag commented in my tweets for this group.
Yeah, what did he respond?
He didn't.
Oh.
He just doesn't respond. Will responded though. Will got at me and was like, "Hey, good job. I'd come, but I can't." So that was nice of him. But yeah, people like Josh should be here, in my opinion. So not to pick on you, Josh, but I'm picking on you, Josh, because he is a well-known WordPress developer in the area. So it'd be nice for people like him and other people that know a lot about WordPress to come here and do these talks as well.
Not me.
Or you. Yeah.
Mine's February 27th. So.
You're doing one next
On the
month.
way.
So, and I'm not just talking about dev ones either. Admin ones too, because I'm doing the admin one as well.
Right. So if you have a real troublesome client or something like that you wish you could just sit down and be like, look, this is what you're doing to close your site up. Send them to the talk of the